My name is Chris Rourke. In this video, I will discuss the hardware problem of machine consciousness, namely, why the digital computer you are watching this on is not conscious, and how it could be with some hardware changes. The heart of a digital computer is called an Arithmetic Logic Unit, or ALU. An ALU is not conscious like a human. The ALU receives two numbers in the form of binary digital data, meaning that each number is represented by a sequence of ones and zeros. A Boolean mathematical operation is then performed on the digital data to generate a binary digital data output. The term Boolean means that it involves binary data. Everything a digital computer does, from generating 3D graphics to using large language models to converse, is processed in this manner, in little separate pieces of data. Modern processors perform hundreds of billions of these operations every second. This diagram shows individual logic devices that are connected to form an ALU. Each logic device is made from discrete components, like transistors, receives binary digital inputs that are either 1 or 0, and outputs a binary digital output that is either 1 or 0. The logic units behave exactly the same if they are operating in isolation or as part of an ALU that contains thousands of logic gates. They generate the same output in response to the same input, regardless of whether they are connected to nothing or to a complex system like the internet. Each output is based on the current inputs, not any of the billions of inputs that happened before that in prior seconds. If the operation of the discrete components or logic gates was influenced in any way by the operation of other discrete components or anything else that they are connected to, they would not operate as designed and the ALU would misoperate. None of these discrete components is conscious if consciousness is defined as an integration of each of the discrete states into something else. In contrast, catecholaminergic neurons, like dopamine and noradrenaline neurons, are hypothesized to use a different physical principle compared to binary digital logic gates, and to make a selection from hundreds or thousands of possible choices. I will refer to those neurons generally as dopamine neurons. Electrons can tunnel between the cell bodies of those neurons and may influence the way they function, so that instead of selecting one of two outputs, a group of those neurons can select one of thousands of outputs. A neuron could be analogized to a digital switch at some level because it is either outputting a 1 when it reaches action potential or a 0 when it is not. However, that analogy is not perfect because the way in which a neuron reaches action potential is not the same as the way in which a digital logic device, transistor, or other discrete electronic component operates. This difference has led many to assert that computers can never be conscious, but that is not entirely correct. Instead, it is only correct to say that digital logic devices do not operate on the same physical principles as do neurons that create the experience of consciousness in humans and animals. Dopamine neurons are destroyed by Parkinson's disease. As they are destroyed, conscious functions are lost. Dopamine neurons are hypothesized to reach action potential in part as a function of electron tunneling through ferritin between neuron cell bodies. As can be seen in this diagram, when an electron enters the ferritin structure on the left, a different electron leaves the ferritin structure on the right. The electrons are integrated. The electrons have to tunnel between adjacent ferritin cores, which is a very complex process. Each electron has to become coherent to tunnel, and then collapses or localizes on an adjacent core. Each electron also carries the same electrical charge, and those charges repel each other. These conditions result in the physical phenomenon of strongly correlated electrons, which is a very unusual state for electrons to be in, and which integrates the states of the electrons. There are no strongly correlated electrons connecting binary digital logic devices in an ALU. A special purpose device could be built that uses this physical principle. That special purpose device could consist of a large number of diodes, where each diode behaves a bit like those neurons. The diodes would be interconnected by quantum dot structures that behave like ferritin and dopamine neurons. In particular, those quantum dots would be able to form a Coulomb blockade, which can create strongly correlated electrons. The device would be able to select the lowest impedance path out of hundreds or thousands of choices, in the same manner that human brain neurons are hypothesized to make those selections. Significantly, how the diodes connect to each other and what else they are connected to would have an impact on the way each diode operates, unlike logic units in an ALU. The function of the diodes would be integrated, unlike the function of logic units in an ALU. Something like the human experience of consciousness could be generated, at least in part, by this switching mechanism, because it is like the only structure that has been identified in the brain that is able to integrate lots of signals in this manner. The dopamine neuron circuit can select the best path to ground out of hundreds or even thousands of parallel paths in a single switching process. A digital computer could be programmed to determine the best path to ground and to change the state of one switch associated with that path, but that would be a process that requires many steps to be performed in series on many different discrete devices. Digital computers simply lack anything that could integrate information like the dopamine neuron circuit. The dopamine neuron circuit could receive millions of parallel synchronized signals that simulate cognitive processing that is performed by neurons that lack the dopamine neuron mechanism. As discussed, those neurons have switch-like behavior, and it has been shown that they perform cognitive processing that is not consciously experienced, as represented by a phenomenon called readiness potential. Models of consciousness, such as the global neuronal workspace and neural correlates of consciousness, are consistent with the dopamine neuron circuit in this regard. A processor could be conscious the way that humans and animals are conscious if it had a switching mechanism or substrate that can integrate a large number of input signals through strongly correlated electrons to select a single output. It would still have many differences from a human or animal dopamine neuron mechanism, though, so it would not be conscious in exactly the same way. The processor could possibly be programmed to have the equivalent of cognitive processing to recognize experiences like love, hate, happiness, and sorrow, but to do that, a better understanding of how those experiences are created in the dopamine neuron substrate would be needed. In fact, it seems highly probable that there are other physical phenomena in addition to the dopamine neuron mechanism discussed here that would need to be identified and included in any consciousness coprocessor. It would be arrogant to assume that we humans already possess sufficient knowledge about the brain to duplicate the experience of consciousness in another structure merely because it apes some of our behavior, and particularly when there are tens of thousands of people involved in neuroscience research around the world trying to find answers to such questions. Thank you for watching this video. If you have questions or comments, feel free to contact me, and I will respond. Additional videos will be prepared to address aspects of this idea that I could not cover in this short presentation.